In the late Middle Ages, Christians strongly desired to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to see places mentioned in the Bible, such as the site where Moses spoke to God in the form of a burning bush, and the tomb of Christ in Jerusalem, from which he was resurrected. These sites were burned into the imaginations of late medieval Christians who knew them from images, such as Dirk Bouts' painting depicting Moses in the burning bush, or this entombment sculpture from Essen, which takes a sculptural replica of the slab of the Holy Sepulchre and builds a narrative image around it. Jerusalem was especially pivotal in the late Middle Ages in that devotion increasingly had to do with affective piety, mostly centered on the Passion of Christ. The devotions respond to Christ's charge to take up your cross and follow me, which is repeated in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and again, more recently in the 15th century, by Thomas à Kempis, who in his influential book, The Imitation of Christ, embroiders this ideal, charging his reader to accompany Christ in every detail of his life. Although Thomas à Kempis might have intended this imitation of Christ to mean the transformation of the human soul through contemplation of the Passion, the term was often interpreted more literally, and perhaps the most tangible way to take up the cross and imitate Christ was to go to Jerusalem and to retrace the path of Christ's final torturous walk to Calvary. As in this painting, the torturous walk became an important subject in late medieval painting. In fact, images such as these woodcuts, either made or commissioned by a convent near Brussels, disseminate the message that walking with one's burdens is hard. They isolate and frame the very concept of staggering across the Holy Land with a weighty cross. Pilgrims who went to the Holy Land often commemorated their experiences by writing about them, or in the case of this example, by commissioning a book of hours with extra text to be said when tracing Christ's footsteps in Jerusalem. The pilgrim is a middle-aged man with a comb-over. He appears with his palm, signifying that he had been to the River Jordan, and he has himself depicted several times in this book of hours. He shows himself as if witnessing places in the Holy Land, such as the Garden of Gethsemane, where the betrayal took place, and the chapel that commemorated Pentecost. And then he has his whole family portrayed at the site of the resurrection. All right, let's look at that in more detail. The family portrait and resurrection prefaces a series of unusual prayers to be said at various sites of the Passion. This grisaille image on the recto shows the post-resurrection appearances of Christ. It's as if the patron, whose name may have been Jan de Tromp, by virtue of his trip to Jerusalem, were ensuring his entire family's resurrection. Nuns and religious women, however, had little chance of actually visiting the Holy Land. Channels for physically experiencing the sites in the Holy Land where Jesus walked and suffered were closed to women religious because they lacked funds or were denied permission or because they were bound to their convents by stabilitas loci. Instead, they invented, developed, and revised existing strategies for virtually visiting Jerusalem and the other holy places. As I intend to show, they often relied on kinesthetic devotions into which they could lose themselves in mind, emotion, and to some degree in body in a passionate, virtual Holy Land. I'm Kate Rudy, and in this talk, I'll consider virtual pilgrimages in the convent and how nuns and religious women used devotional objects and practices to imagine Jerusalem in the late Middle Ages. To do this, I'll explore a number of metaphors that operated, especially as they pertain to devotional images. I've color-coded the backgrounds of the slides to correspond to these themes. So the first is that up is good and down is bad. And secondly, I want to think about how the heavenly Jerusalem is mapped onto the earthly Jerusalem. And thirdly, to consider ways in which the convent can become a model for Jerusalem. And fourth and finally, how the Holy Land itself is sacred by virtue of Christ having shed his blood there. And I'm showing you there some bloody images of bloody footsteps. Now, to begin with, in their important book from 1980, Metaphors We Live By, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson examine the big metaphors that make sense of all the other metaphors we use in daily life. One set of these has to do with our orientation in space, whereby up is good and down is bad. For example, you might say, I'm feeling down today, or the chips are down, or I'm in a rut. Alternatively, you might say, I'm on top of the world, or I feel elated. None of these things that we say would make any sense if we didn't have the meta-metaphor of up is good and down is bad. Now, that thought operates in a number of medieval images as well. For example, this image made for Augustinian nuns in Amersfoort. It shows the ladders, which are a metaphor for spiritual ascent. The blue ladder is the ladder for the beginning nun who climbs rungs labeled good willingness, convent discipline, and true belief. So those are at the basic level. After that, she graduates to the green ladder, where she climbs rungs called simple obedience, spiritual exercises, and the fulfillment of commandments. Finally, she can mount the red ladder, where she masters heartfelt devotion and heavenly contemplation before finally reaching caritas, or charity, at the top of the red ladder, where the red star is, and that's the goal here. So this metaphor is highly conceptual, in contrast with the much more corporeal metaphor of pilgrimage as ascent that I want to talk about next. Now, such an approach is mapped onto this miniature depicting the walled city of Jerusalem. It utilizes a cartographic format, teams with figures, and recapitulates a pilgrimage. Now, for example, pilgrims actually appear in the image in modern garb, and they stand as proxies for the viewer. They make their way to the lower left of the frame to join Christ upward on his movement into and then eventually through the city. Then they follow him on his judicial trials through the walled city, which then departs on the lower right-hand side, and before Christ then climbs up toward Calvary, and the pilgrims can imagine witnessing the crucifixion at the top here, and then joining Christ on his final ascent from the grave, so that the resurrection is at the pinnacle of this entire composition. This panel, made by an anonymous Southern Netherlandish painter and now in Lisbon, presents multiple episodes of the Passion of Christ in a Jerusalem cityscape. It shares the same basic structure as the Saluzzo miniature I was just showing you, but this depicts events from the Passion on a massive scale. I'm going to use images from a website that's cited at the bottom of the page here because it's one of the few images available in color. Now, Gothic letters A through O lead the viewer through the picture in a chronological route. And the anonymous author of this blog post has relabeled those in larger green and yellow letters so that we can see them. And now I'll show you how that looks as we move through. The painting is said to be a gift from the Emperor Maximilian to his cousin, Queen Eleanor of Portugal, who appears at the bottom of the composition in the garb of a Franciscan tertiary. And she began to wear this in 1495 when she was widowed. Now, she kneels in front of another woman who is probably her daughter, Isabel of Aragon, depicted as a widow before her marriage to Emmanuel the Fortunate in 1497, which means that the panel was probably executed between 1495 and 1497. Upon her death, Queen Eleanor left the painting to the Madre de Deus convent of Poor Clares in Lisbon. The convent remained active until 1871, and is now in the National Museum of Tiles in Portugal, in Lisbon. The painting therefore spent most of its functional years before it became an objet d'art in a museum as a locus for devotion, first for two noble women and then for a group of poor clares, none of whom presumably ever saw Holy Land in the flesh. Now, the donor and her daughter appear at the lowest level together with St. Peter in the cave. And he is humbly penitent here in this cave, praying hard after denying not knowing Christ. Now, those two these figures are outside the chronological order of the Passion that are labeled with the various letters. But as the letters make clear, the events wend their way around the painting in a quite circuitous way. They appear with A, the Last Supper, and then end up over here, down below, Christ praying in Gethsemane, which is interesting because at his feet is another hole, a cave, that mirrors the hole or cave that Peter's in over here. But this hole or cave is filled with the Old Testament people who were stuck in purgatory waiting for redemption. Now, the image after that, it ends up, where does it go after that? It goes to the foreground with the betrayal and winds its way around in this incredible Passion parade through the architecture of the city and up through these buildings for the meetings with the Pilate, Caiaphas, and Annas before going again to the Ecce Homo scene and winding its way around. Now, the carrying of the cross at K then moves us across the top of the panel where the culminating moment of Christ's death happens at the top at M, and then it makes its way over to the deposition from the cross, and again, and then into the sepulcher for the burial. What I want to point out here is that as the letters make clear, the events wend their way in the circuitous route, but they finish at the top, suggesting that the death and redemption in these scenes surmount all the other events, both physically and metaphorically. You can see that a similar approach to depicting the Passion appears in these two woodcut fragments, which appeared on the art market in the 1990s. They may have been used in a convent. Now, there was an article by Jean and Safri. They have proposed that the prints comprised fragments of a large poster made from multiple blocks. And I'm showing you their schematic diagram showing the relationship between these small fragments and the much larger whole from which they formed a part. So the original size of the whole thing, they estimated, was 1.2 by 1.1 meters, so quite large indeed and nearly square. The fact that this poster was serially produced in hundreds of copies and quite large, these facts throw open the possibility that it functioned for groups of people who could have used it communally. For example, it could have been distributed to many convents of Franciscan sisters along the Rhine, where it might have hung on a wall of a conventual chapter during the week before Easter so that the sisters could imagine following Christ through the city on their way toward the final episode of the story, which is resurrection on Easter. Now, this leads us to the next metaphor, that the architecture of Jerusalem is a gateway to eternal life. We see that metaphor operate in images of the Last Judgment, where the damned are shunted downward into the maw of hell, whereas the saved are directed into a golden building where they importantly move upward to meet St. Peter and everlasting life, which is the goal of Christianity. Now, architecture functions in an interesting way in this manuscript, Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal, manuscript 212, made in a Franciscan environment in the second half of the 15th century. The manuscript presents a virtual pilgrimage as a series of churches and chapels. The texts and images begin by evoking the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as you see here at the top of the page. Now, turning the folio is tantamount to entering the church. So let's do that now. Turning the folio, we encounter this opening, which shows the interior of the basilica, as if turning the page were the equivalent to opening the door and passing through it. The entire opening presents chapels within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, including a representation of the Holy Sepulchre itself, and the chapel where Christ appeared to Mary Magdalene. And there, it's as if the Noli Me Tangere event had become an attribute identifying the chapel. By the next event, showing Christ appearing to the Virgin, the chapel has melted away. And that is also true when we turn the folio and encounter two more chapels within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one housing a piece of the column of the flagellation, and one commemorating the place where the casting of lots for Christ's garment took place. And on the next folio, the recto side, we walk to the church at Mount Sion, step inside, and suddenly we're transported to the Last Supper. And we turn the page again, and that draws us deeper into this chapel. And the architecture suddenly fades from view, and the beholder is left at the sight of Thomas fingering Christ's wound without any walls separating her from the action, and at the sight of the Dormition of the Virgin, where she could simply join the apostles at Mary's bedside. Now here, the architecture is a conduit for an experience that becomes less and less mediated and more immersive. Another way, whoops, my dog is getting sick here. Are you okay? Another way to bring the architecture of Jerusalem to the convent was to inscribe it on the very walls. And here I'm showing you the cloister walkway at the Cistercian monastery of Babenhausen, which you very well may know. Inscribed within one of the bays of the cloister wall is a horizontal line 173 centimeters long, with an inscription in Latin explaining that this is the true length of the sepulchre of Mary. And another bay presents a second line, this one 201 centimeters long, and it too bears an inscription. It says, "This is the true length of the sarcophagus in which Christ rested for 3 days." Now, just below that, here, is a three-sided rectangle measuring just 24 by 51 centimeters, so quite small. The shape is surmounted by a cross, which represents the body of Christ, and it accompanies another inscription, which I will translate for you. "Look at this fissure, and do not scorn what you read. The depth of this is that which the sepulchre of Christ had." Sorry about my slightly tortuous translation of that text here. Now, these inscriptions take abstract two-dimensional shapes and turn them into something immediate and tangible, something bearing an indexical touch with their antecedents, not unlike images of the measured wound of Christ, such as this quite early image in the Villers Miscellany from about 1320, where the inscription around the big gaping wound of Christ at the center follows, it traces that mandorla around, and it specifies what it is we're looking at. This is the measured wound of Christ. And so sometimes these abstract forms, therefore, need a label so that we can appreciate what it is that they are indexically pointing to. The next step was to imagine that the convent was in fact Jerusalem, and to take pilgrimages around it as if one were witnessing the events of the Passion firsthand. Now, printers in Leiden and Antwerp and Delft found large audiences for Herr Bethlehem's Guide, to virtual pilgrimage, and they published it beginning around 1510 in at least 17 print runs, which attests to the work's broad appeal. Now, this section of my talk concerns a particular copy, now in The Hague, published in 1518. And I've selected this particular version because it bears numerous marginal notes that reveal how the reader used the booklet and turned her convent into a model of Jerusalem. According to the preface, this is a devotional meditation on the Passion, from place to place where our beloved Lord suffered. A devoted priest who lived in Jerusalem for a long time has measured and written this. Measured is the key word here. The author, this Herr Bethlehem, was said to have jotted down the distances between the holy sites in Jerusalem. These distances comprise an integral part of the devotional experience, so that the reader can imagine taking the same number of footsteps that Christ did while meditating on the woodcuts. These metric relics are related to the measured copies of the true cross, the sepulchres of Christ and Mary, and the measured wound. Besides confirming an exactitude of experience, they ensure the authenticity of the resulting document, that the information was gathered firsthand. The text is organized around the days of the week so that a reader completes a pilgrimage during the course of 7 days. The reader begins on Monday at the house where our beloved Lord ate his last meal with the apostles. And then the reader is to travel 3,500 ells to the Mount of Olives, where he or she devoutly reads one Paternoster and one Ave Maria, where an ell is a distance of measure based on an arm's length. Then the reader travels 34 ells to the place where Christ's most beloved disciples fell asleep. The reader has added notes in the margins that reveal how she used the book. She apparently practiced her devotions to the Last Supper in the hospital corridor near the metal door. So that's that inscription just below the woodcut. The location of her devotion may relate, in fact, to the particular episode on which she was meditating. She may have associated the conventual hospital with the Last Supper because partaking of the body of Christ was considered the best medicine available. She then traced a circuitous route to get from the dinner table to Gethsemane, where she had to begin at the chapel of St. Anne and then go along the silent walkway from the doorway, 35 ells from there, until you reach the silent winding staircase. And that's what is written in the note on the recto side. Then she traced a circuitous route to get from the dinner table to Gethsemane, where she begins in the chapel of St. Anne, then walks on the silent walkway from the doorway, 35 ells from there, until you reach the winding staircase. So that's the text written at the lower part of the page. Following that, she was to fall on her knees in the middle of the hospital corridor and to imitate Christ praying at Gethsemane. What's clear here is that she is using the places in her convent and renaming them as locations in Jerusalem where events of the Passion had taken place, using chapels and corridors and even doorways as locations where she would stop and perform imitative devotions. The other pages in the booklet similarly have added handwritten instructions for imitating Christ while walking through the convent. And you can see a selection of those on the bottom margins of these pages. But on the page depicting Christ before Pilate, the nun reveals another way in which she used the book within the convent. She wrote, and I've circled this part, she wrote, "Walk 3 times around the pont and then fall to knees." By walking 3 times around the pont, she apparently is walking 3 times around the cloistered garden. And she's doing this that's labeled E on the diagram. She's doing this in order to equal the distance that Christ walked, and therefore taking very seriously the distances that are given in the text. So knowing this, we can now make sense of another type of marginal note that she adds to the printed text. In the margin, and I've highlighted this, the top right one in yellow, she writes 27 fois, 27 times, in the margin next to 3500 Ellen, which suggests that she practiced walking around the cloister 27 times in order to embody Christ's journey from the Last Supper to the Mount of Olives. And then to walk to the place where Christ's three most beloved disciples fell asleep, which was only 34 ells away, she only has to circumambulate the cloister one time. So that is the Roman numeral 1 at the bottom of the page next to 34 ells. In other words, she turns the convent into a replica of Jerusalem so that she can follow Christ in mind and also in body during the events of the Passion. A similar strategy appears in this manuscript, now in London, British Library manuscript 31001, written by a Dominican nun around 1500. Now, this, what looks like a very jumbled text, is actually a calendar with instructions to visit one of the 7 principal churches of Rome each day. Rome was a kind of New Jerusalem where many of the important relics from the Passion had been brought. And those are, in fact, enumerated elsewhere in the same manuscript. But what I want to talk about is the codes in this particular text. And what you see is that the red letters A through G refer to the 7 principal churches of Rome. So either the Dominican convent had 7 altars, which the nuns treated as the 7 Roman churches and might have called them Santa Maria Maggiore and San Giovanni in Laterano and so forth, or else they had a set of paintings like the one I'm showing you here. This is the only surviving one from what must have been a set of 7. And this is San Giovanni in Laterano, and you'll see that it has the letter A at the upper right-hand corner. The paintings also recall those from a series of the 7 principal churches of Rome commissioned by the female Dominican convent at Augsburg for the Jubilee Indulgence of 1500. And here I'm showing you the panel with the churches of St. Lawrence and St. Sebastian, which were juxtaposed with events from the Passion. Now, turning back to the Dominican manuscript, it clarifies this relationship between Rome and Jerusalem. It states, "Just as you can visit the 7 churches of Rome, you can also visit the Holy Land in the same manner, as if you were there in the Holy Land, visiting the holy places that you should honor as Christ's landscape, because it is written that we should pray to him in the city where his feet stood. Here, in the same way that the churches of Rome are visited, we should also follow the example of the Virgin Mary, who, as St. Bridget described, visited the holy places daily after her dear Son ascended into heaven. Therefore, we should visit these holy places with her." Now, the Dominican manuscript in London, 31001, it lists relics contained in each of the 7 churches of Rome that would have been virtually visited during the peregrinations. These indicate that in Church A, San Giovanni in Laterano, one could find the heads of Saints Peter and Paul, the table from the Last Supper, Christ's purple robe, Christ's diaper, and the altar that St. John the Baptist constructed in the wilderness, along with his hair shirt. And the main relic at St. Peter's was the Veronica, but one could also visit the bodies of Saints Simon and Judas and half of the bodies of Saints Peter and Paul. Santa Maria Maggiore housed a relic of special significance to nuns and female religious, namely the crib of Jesus, complete with the hay at the bottom and a couple of his diapers. Many of the relics of the Passion could be seen at Santa Croce, including a good deal of the true cross and part of the cross of the good thief, as well as his arm, 12 thorns from the crown of thorns, and the sponge. So it's clear that from this list that Rome was brandishing the plundered remains of the Christian Holy Land and had become the New Jerusalem and premier pilgrimage destination. The manuscript also provides this text. So what's interesting here is that running along the sides of the page in red are the words, "as if in the holy places." So one is supposed to read these texts, which describe walking through the wilderness, the Mount of Tabor, Bethany, the Hofken, which is the garden at Gethsemane, the houses of Annas, Caiaphas, Judas, and Pilate, and so forth. And so one reads these texts while imagining walking in the holy places. Now, the manuscript originally contained this group of hand-colored prints so that the reader could really imagine the scenes from the Passion much more vividly. And walking through the text and walking through these images came hand in hand and helped the reader to transport herself to Jerusalem. The prints have now been removed from the manuscript, but what is clear is that the hand coloring, and you can see that this red is dripping over the printed line, so it's extending beyond what the printer had in mind. And the hand coloring might have been done by the Dominican nuns, and it adds extra blood to the Passion. Now, that is the topic I want to discuss next, which is the fact that Christ bled on Calvary meant that the land itself is a blood-soaked relic. And we see this idea in representations of Christ's bloody footprints in the Villers Miscellany, leading up from the bottom of the page. And they're part of the Arma Christi, the instruments of the Passion. And this idea is also clear in Gergen Tossignian's tightly cropped Christ as Man of Sorrows, which frames the wound and blood with this incredible feeling of pathos that we get from Christ's glance looking out of the picture plane in this tightly cropped space, making contact with the viewer and asking her to have empathy. Because the earth was blood-soaked and was also a contact relic of Christ, pilgrims collected earth relics. One of the earliest surviving examples is a reliquary box with stones from the Holy Land now kept in the Vatican. The object was made in the 6th or 7th century and is part of the Sancta Sanctorum treasure, that is, the group of prestigious objects and relics that Pope Leo III began storing in the Church of San Giovanni in Laterano in the 9th century. The wooden box contains rocks and dirt from various holy places, while the box's lid has images of the events that took place at those sites, painted in tempera with a little bit of gold. Now, at the lower register are the Nativity and the Baptism, and filling the entire middle register is the Crucifixion with Christ's outstretched arms, in which the artist has also painted a mountainous backdrop to suggest Mount Calvary. At the top register are representations of the three Marys at the tomb and the Ascension. So similar to the arrangement of the multi-episodic Passion panels we saw earlier, here the Ascension with its sense of upward movement conveyed by the apostles and Mary with their arms raised and the angels with their fluttering wings, that scene appears anagogically at the top of the visual field. While the painted fields capture the highlights of Christ's life, they also cover a great expanse of land from Bethany to the Jordan River to Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives, where pilgrims visited Christ's last footprint before he ascended. The box also contains rocks and earth from these same places. Without the images, however, the rocks and dirt would be mute, but the images give these humble relics a context and a voice. Augustine Black Sisters, that is, nuns who followed the rule of St. Augustine and ran hospitals, reinvented the earth reliquary in the late 15th century in the form of besloten hofjes, or enclosed gardens. They incorporated humble souvenirs into multifaceted devotional objects, which consist of oak boxes containing painted and gilded sculptures, copies of medallions made of pipe clay, relics wrapped in silk and bearing paper or parchment phylacteries, pieces of colored glass, pilgrimage badges, countless silk flowers, and small representations of animals made out of wire, and printed and hand-painted images, occasionally set in miniature frames, and, important for this context, earth relics. In this breathless plethora, they epitomize a reliquary aesthetic, an additive compilation of parts both found and manufactured. Many of them have a gate of words stretching across the first plane as if the words were key to entering the garden within, as is the case with this Beslotenhofje. And here's a detail of that. And I'm showing you that with a painting from a manuscript showing a Franciscan sister using prayer to enter a garden where Christ dwells. The user of the Beslotenhofje has to also pass through the word gate to enter the garden of prayer. Words, in fact, play an important part in the interiors of these Beslotenhofjes as they help to identify some of the objects. Specifically, the phylacteries or authentiques provide little labels or speech scrolls for the items. Many of these are now missing, but the remaining ones help to understand the emotional charge of some of the objects. This is my overview of the kinds of objects stuffed into the jumbled horror vacui that is the Beslotenhofje. The two big categories are found objects and objects made expressly for Beslotenhofjes. In the first category, there are both natural objects and human-made ones. These include pilgrim badges and parchment rondels that evoke the Eucharist, and molded metal filigree and silk-wrapped flowers such as this one. But for the moment, I want to concentrate on the natural objects, the stones and bones. Most spectacular are the crystals that, according to the accompanying labels, represent water that froze at the moment of Christ's birth. At least 3 of these labels occur in the extant Beslotenhofjes. These indicate that beholders found the material curious and sought to incorporate it into the sacred history by providing an explanation of its colorless crystalline form. Referring to the crystals as ice that had permanently frozen at the moment of Christ's birth is a poetic way of connecting the miraculous event with what must have seemed to be a particularly miraculous substance, a permanent ice cube. That 3 of these pieces of stone have survived in Beslotenhofjes attests to the repetition of the story to accompany crystal or quartz. Stories crystallized into labels help give sacral significance to extraordinary and awe-inspiring naturalia. Although the crystal probably did not come from Bethlehem, it was probably transported from elsewhere, as it did not come from the area around Mechelen, where the Beslotenhofjes were constructed. So these pieces of so-called ice have been wrapped, beaded, and set against a red background, and therefore visually amplified. This Beslotenhofje contains several items from the Holy Land and embroiders them into a dense garden. For example, it contains one of the few non-human bones relevant to sacred history. Let's take a closer look. That is a chicken bone, and according to the label, the bone is from the chicken that crowed 3 times before Peter denied Christ. And such relics fulfilled a desire to bring distant events into a tangible present. Here I'm showing you a piece of the stone taken from the column of the flagellation. It is mounted with decorative twisting wire, and the textual background recalls the label framing the wound of Christ, without which it would just be a mute abstraction. So that is what I'm thinking about here. This mandorla, which makes sense because it has text wrapping around it. A similar framing enhances this object, a piece of the bread from the Last Supper, which brings an essential piece of the Passion into the shrine. And this is a piece of the stone from Calvary, a piece of bright white marble, specifically sewn to a piece of contrasting cloth designed to set it off visually. The authentiques labeled geological relics that came from places in which important events from sacred history had taken place. Pieces of rock helped to construct the New Jerusalem in Rome and even in Mechelen, where of course, the metaphor for heavenly Jerusalem is operating. This is the terminus in the Christian mythology. Now, in this talk, I have presented 4 metaphors that operated in the practice of virtual pilgrimage. In convents where access to the physical Jerusalem was severely restricted, these metaphors helped to construct meaningful proxies, which could harness the imagination and turn abstract ideas into physical sensations. In the end, these procedures turned the local environment into a model of Jerusalem, helping to turn simple activities such as walking from one area of the convent to another, or collecting stones and small objects, or wrapping silk threads, and turning these objects into ones laden with meaning. Thanks very much for listening, and please state what topics you'd like to hear about in future videos. Bye for now.